You ever notice how people are comfortable with average? They clap for predictable. They celebrate ordinary. They feel safe around minds they can measure. But the exact moment, the math stops making sense. That's when the smiles twitch. That's when the whispers start. Because nothing terrifies the world more than a mind it can't calculate. See, they were fine when you were talented. They were okay when you were smart. They could handle gifted. But then the numbers changed. The pattern broke. The equation no longer balanced. And suddenly, you weren't impressive. You were illegal. An illegal level of genius. Unexplainable, uncontainable, uncomfortable. And when the math finally hit them, it fried their circuits. And tonight, we're going to talk about why that happens and why you should never, ever dim your brilliance just to make the system feel safe. You ever walk into a room and feel it? That subtle shift in the air. The polite smiles that don't quite reach the eyes. The conversations that get a little quieter. The energy that tightens just a bit. That's not coincidence. That's not imagination. That's mathematics. Genius makes average nervous. Average is comfortable. Average has rules. It has routines, templates, predictable outcomes. Average knows exactly how high to aim, so it never risks falling too far. It lives in a neat little box labeled reasonable expectations, and inside that box, everybody survives. Nobody stands out too much. Nobody stretches reality. Nobody forces the room to rethink itself. But then you show up, and you don't fit the formula. See, average people don't mind talent. Talent can be categorized, measured, ranked. Talent competes inside the system. It follows the scoreboard. It plays by the rules everyone agreed on. Genius? Genius rewrites the rules mid-game and doesn't ask for permission. That's when the discomfort begins. Because when someone operating at an illegal level of intelligence enters the space, the comparison becomes unavoidable. And comparison is a dangerous mirror. It doesn't just reflect skill, it exposes effort. It reveals limits. It whispers the question no one wants to hear. If they can think like that, what excuse do I have? And that whisper grows louder. Average survives by blending in, by agreeing silently to not push too far beyond the group's ceiling. There's an unspoken pact in most rooms. Don't make the rest of us look small. Don't move so fast that we feel stuck. Don't see so clearly that our confusion becomes obvious. Stay within range. Stay relatable. Stay manageable. But genius doesn't negotiate with ceilings. It doesn't slow down to make the pace comfortable. It doesn't dilute ideas so they're easier to digest. It doesn't apologize for clarity. And that's where the friction sparks. Not because genius is cruel, not because it's arrogant, but because it refuses to shrink. And average hates what it can't predict. When your mind connects dots before they even see the dots exist, it shakes them. When you solve problems they're still trying to understand, it unsettles them. When you speak ideas they didn't even know were possible, it threatens their internal hierarchy. Suddenly, the ranking system they relied on doesn't work anymore. The ladder they've been climbing feels shorter. The ground under their confidence cracks just a little. So what do people do when they feel exposed? They label. Overthinking, too intense, unrealistic, lucky. Trying too hard, they shrink what they don't understand because it's easier than expanding themselves. Genius makes average nervous because it disrupts identity. If someone believes they are intelligent, capable, ahead of the curve, and then you walk in and operate 3 dimensions above that, it forces a painful recalibration. Not everyone is willing to recalibrate. Some would rather deny the math than admit the gap. And the nervousness doesn't always look like fear. Sometimes it looks like sarcasm. Sometimes it looks like silence. Sometimes it looks like exclusion. Sometimes it even disguises itself as advice. You should tone it down. Don't intimidate people. be more realistic. But underneath all of it is the same equation. You represent possibility, and possibility is terrifying to anyone who's settled, because if you can think bigger, move smarter, execute faster, imagine further, then the limits they accepted were never real, and that realization burns. Genius doesn't attack average, it exposes it, just by existing, just by thinking differently, just by refusing to compress itself into a shape that fits comfortably in a mediocre system. And when the numbers don't line up anymore, when the mental math collapses, when their internal calculator flashes error, that's the moment the room shifts. That's the moment the nervous energy creeps in. That's the moment they realize they're not just watching talent. They're witnessing something they can't measure. They love equations, clean ones, balanced ones, ones where both sides behave exactly the way they're supposed to. Input equals output. Effort equals reward. Stay in line, follow the formula, and the result will make sense. That's how the system keeps everyone calm. Predictability is soothing. Predictability is safe. But then the equation breaks, and that's when fear begins. Because when something doesn't add up, when the numbers don't land where they were expected to, people don't immediately celebrate innovation. They panic. They squint at the board. They reject the steps. They assume there must be a mistake. There has to be. The formula has worked for years. The pattern has held steady. The graph has followed its obedient little curve. Then you show up and the curve spikes. Not gradually. Not politely. It jumps. You solve faster. You see deeper. You anticipate 3 moves ahead while they're still debating the first. And suddenly, the comfortable math they've trusted their entire identity to doesn't work anymore. Fear doesn't always scream. Sometimes it calculates. It tries to restore balance. Maybe it was luck. Maybe it's temporary. Maybe they had help. Anything to patch the crack in the equation. Because if the formula they believed in collapses, what else collapses with it? Their confidence, their hierarchy, their sense of control. People build their self-worth on predictable comparisons. If I work this hard, I'll be this successful. If I know this much, I'll be this respected. It's a tidy little ladder, each rung earned, each step justified. But when someone operates beyond the ladder entirely, when someone builds a staircase in midair while they're still counting steps, the entire structure trembles. That trembling feels like fear. Not because genius is violent, not because brilliance attacks, but because it exposes the illusion that the system is complete. It proves there are variables they never accounted for, dimensions they never explored, speeds they never imagined, and humans hate variables they can't control. When the equation breaks, the first instinct is denial. That's not realistic. That won't last. That's not how things are done. They cling to procedure like a life raft, because procedure means predictability. And predictability means they don't have to confront the uncomfortable truth that someone just rewrote the math. But you didn't cheat. You just saw what they didn't. You saw shortcuts in complexity. You saw patterns hidden inside chaos. You saw opportunities disguised as problems. Where they saw a wall, you saw an angle. Where they saw limitation, you saw leverage. And when you acted on it, the result didn't match their expectation. That mismatch is terrifying. It forces a recalculation. It demands humility. It asks them to admit that their understanding was incomplete. And not everyone is brave enough to update their software. Some would rather call the anomaly dangerous than admit the system is outdated. So the whispers start. You're moving too fast. You're skipping steps. You're disrupting the process. Of course you are. The process was designed for averages. It was designed to keep outcomes within range. It was never meant to handle someone thinking beyond the template. When the equation breaks, fear doesn't just question you. It questions itself. It wonders how long it has been operating on limited data. It wonders how many ceilings were imaginary. It wonders how many boundaries were self-imposed. And that wondering is uncomfortable. Because if one equation can break, all of them can. If one mind can outgrow the formula, maybe the formula was never the limit. Maybe the limits were habits. Maybe the boundaries were agreements. Maybe the fear was the only constant holding the structure together. So when they look at you and see the numbers bending, the outcomes exploding past expectation, the logic stretching into places they never mapped, they don't see inspiration first. They see instability. They see the risk of losing control. They see the possibility that everything they thought was fixed isn't. And in that moment, when their internal calculator flashes error, when their neat little columns refuse to balance, when their tidy worldview fractures under the weight of your expansion, that's when it happens. The equation breaks, and fear steps in to fill the space where certainty used to live. They applaud talent. Oh, they love talent. Talent is safe. Talent is entertaining. Talent performs on cue. It shows up, dazzles a little, bows politely, and stays within the lines. Talent works hard, wins trophies, collects compliments. It fits neatly into categories. Best in class, top performer, rising star. The system knows exactly where to place talent on the shelf, and shelves make people comfortable. Because if they can place you, they can measure you. If they can measure you, they can compare you. And if they can compare you, they can compete without feeling threatened. Talent plays the game. It respects the scoreboard. It follows the path that's already been paved. But brilliance doesn't ask where the shelf is. It questions why the shelf exists. That's when the applause starts to fade, because brilliance doesn't just perform better inside the system. It exposes the system's limits. It doesn't just win the game. It changes how the game is played. And when you start changing rules instead of following them, people stop clapping and start calculating. They were comfortable when you were impressive. They were fine when you were exceptional. As long as you were operating within a recognizable framework, they could admire you. They could even support you. You were proof that the system worked. But the moment you stepped beyond it, the moment your ideas became too original, your execution too precise, your vision too far ahead, that admiration curdled. Because brilliance forces reflection. It makes people confront the uncomfortable gap between what they are capable of and what they have settled for. Talent inspires competition. Brilliance inspires insecurity. When you're merely talented, others can say, "If I train harder, I can reach that." When you're brilliant, they start to wonder, "What if I can't?" That question is dangerous. It shakes identity. It pokes at pride. It exposes limits people have quietly made peace with, and rather than stretch those limits, many would rather shrink you. So the narrative shifts. You're overcomplicating things. You think too much. You don't have to prove anything. Why can't you just do it the normal way? Normal? That's the favorite word of the threatened. Because brilliance rarely looks normal. It sees angles others miss. It connects ideas that seem unrelated. It solves problems people didn't even know were problems. And when those solutions make traditional approaches look outdated, the room gets uncomfortable. They applaud talent because it entertains them. They attack brilliance because it unsettles them. Brilliance doesn't just raise the bar. It moves it so high that some people can't even see it anymore. And when the standard shifts beyond their comfort zone, instead of climbing, they criticize. It's easier to call someone intense than to increase your own intensity. It's easier to label someone unrealistic than to expand your own imagination. It's easier to mock what you don't understand than to admit you don't understand it. So the applause turns into side eyes. Support turns into silence. encouragement turns into subtle resistance. Not because you changed, but because you outgrew the frame they built for you. Talent fits in the frame, brilliance breaks it. And broken frames make people nervous. They preferred the version of you they could predict. The version that shined but didn't blind. The version that excelled but didn't disrupt. But when your mind starts operating on a frequency they can't tune into, when your results stretch beyond their imagination, the reaction isn't celebration, it's defense. Defense of ego, defense of status, defense of the comfortable hierarchy they've memorized. Because brilliance doesn't just challenge the competition. It challenges the culture. It challenges the pace. It challenges the unspoken agreement that says, let's all stay within range so nobody feels too small. And when you refuse to stay within range, when your ideas ripple beyond what's convenient, when your execution exposes complacency, the applause grows quieter. Not because you're wrong, but because you're right in a way that demands change. And change is heavier than clapping. Your mind is not just different, it's dangerous. Not dangerous in the loud, chaotic, breaking windows kind of way. No, that's predictable chaos. That's easy to identify, easy to isolate, easy to remove. The real threat, the real disruption, is calculated. Precise mediocrity survives on comfort, on repetition, on patterns that never stretch too far. It builds systems designed to maintain balance, not excellence. It rewards consistency over creativity. It praises effort as long as the results don't disturb the hierarchy. And then there's you. You don't just complete tasks. You redesign them. You don't just answer questions. You question the questions. You don't just adapt to the environment. You analyze it, decode it, and start seeing the invisible wires holding it together. That's when the tension begins. Because mediocrity depends on predictability. It needs people to think within range, to operate within boundaries, to accept that this is how it's always been done is a valid reason to keep doing it. But your mind doesn't accept tradition as truth. It doesn't accept repetition as proof. It searches for leverage, for optimization, for angles nobody bothered to explore. And when you find them, you expose inefficiency. You expose laziness disguised as process. You expose fear disguised as policy. That's why your mind feels like a threat. Not because you're trying to attack anyone, not because you're seeking destruction, but because clarity is disruptive. When you see what others ignore, when you articulate what others avoid, when you execute at a level that makes stagnation obvious, you become a mirror, and mirrors are uncomfortable. Mediocrity doesn't like mirrors. It prefers fog. It prefers distraction. It prefers environments where everyone moves at the same safe speed, so no one has to confront the possibility that they could move faster. But your brain doesn't idle. It runs simulations in silence. It calculates outcomes before they happen. It sees domino effects 3 moves ahead, while others are debating whether something is possible. You're already mapping the path to make it inevitable. That acceleration threatens the status quo, because the status quo was designed for maintenance, not mastery. It was built to keep things stable, not exceptional. When someone begins operating at an illegal level of insight, when someone's ideas start bending reality instead of obeying it, the comfortable equilibrium starts to wobble, and wobbling feels like danger. They may not say it out loud. They may even compliment you. You're so smart. You're intense. You think differently. But beneath the praise is caution. Because if your approach works, if your strategy outperforms the traditional method, then the traditional method loses authority. And authority hates losing control. Your mind doesn't wait for permission. It doesn't slow down to match the room's tempo. It doesn't shrink ideas to make them easier to swallow. It expands. It explores. It reconstructs. That reconstruction process exposes weak foundations. It reveals which rules were arbitrary, which limits were self-imposed, which barriers were psychological. And once that exposure happens, there's no going back to comfortable ignorance. That's the threat. Mediocrity can coexist with talent. It can tolerate effort. It can even celebrate moderate success. But it cannot comfortably exist alongside someone who refuses to accept the ceiling as permanent. Because once one person proves the ceiling can be shattered, everyone else has to decide whether they'll reach higher or admit they never wanted to. Your mind forces that decision. It challenges the pace. It questions the logic. It accelerates the evolution of any space it enters. And evolution is disruptive. It replaces outdated structures. It renders certain habits obsolete. It shifts power from tradition to innovation. That shift feels unstable to those who rely on stability for identity. So they resist, not always loudly, sometimes subtly, sometimes through doubt, sometimes through dismissal, sometimes through isolation. But resistance is the natural reaction of a system being outgrown. And you don't even have to try. Just by thinking deeply, just by seeing clearly, just by refusing to compress your intelligence into something digestible and safe, you tilt the balance. You are not loud chaos. You are silent disruption. You are the variable that doesn't fit the formula. And mediocrity senses it the moment you walk into the room. They call it unpredictable like it's an insult. Like not being easy to calculate is a flaw. Like if they can't chart your next move on a neat little graph, there must be something wrong with you. But here's the twist: being uncalculatable is your superpower. Systems are built on prediction, schedules, hierarchies, strategies. All of it depends on knowing what comes next. If they can predict you, they can prepare for you. If they can prepare for you, they can contain you. If they can contain you, you're no longer a threat. You're just another variable in their tidy little equation. But you don't behave like a variable. You behave like a glitch in the code. You pivot before they react. You evolve before they adapt. You change angles while they're still studying the last one. And that inability to pin you down, that's not chaos. That's leverage. Because predictable people are easy to compete with. Uncalculatable minds are impossible to corner. When they think you'll zig, you've already redesigned the board. When they expect hesitation, you accelerate. When they prepare for defense, you're nowhere near the battlefield they mapped out. It's not random. It's layered thinking. It's depth. It's the ability to see multiple paths and choose the one nobody anticipated. That unpredictability makes average nervous. They like patterns. Patterns feel safe. Patterns mean stability. If you always respond the same way, think the same way, act within known boundaries, they can relax. They can slot you into their mental filing cabinet labeled understood. But you don't fit in drawers. Your ideas don't follow straight lines. They curve. They intersect. They jump dimensions. You combine disciplines. You merge opposites. You see opportunity where others see contradiction. And when your actions don't match their expectations, they start to feel off balance. Off balance feels like loss of control. And control is everything to a rigid system. If they can't anticipate your ceiling, they can't limit it. If they can't forecast your next move, they can't block it. If they can't understand your thought process, they can't manipulate it. So they try to label you instead. Erratic, too intense. Hard to read. Complicated. No, just multidimensional. You don't operate on one frequency. You don't think in straight lines. You don't settle for the obvious rote. You analyze layers, motives, timing, psychology. You adjust in real time. You treat every situation like a dynamic equation, not a static rule. That fluidity is power. Because while they're stuck defending against what they expect, you're creating what they never imagined. You're not bound by the script. You improvise. You innovate. You evolve mid-performance. And evolution is impossible to calculate in advance. Being uncalculatable doesn't mean being reckless. It means being adaptable. It means your identity isn't locked into one role, one skill, one predictable pattern. You can be calm or aggressive, strategic or spontaneous, silent or outspoken, focused or explosive. They don't know which version they'll get, and that uncertainty keeps them alert. It forces them to stretch their thinking just to keep up. It denies them the comfort of assumption. It disrupts the illusion that they've figured you out. And once someone believes they've figured you out, they stop respecting your growth. But when they can't define you, they can't dismiss you. You are not a straight line on a graph. You are a shifting trajectory. You don't plateau where they expect. You don't burn out when they predict. You don't crumble under pressure, because pressure is just another variable. You've already calculated from 5 different angles. And while they're busy trying to decode you, you're already 3 moves ahead, rewriting the landscape they're standing on. They want consistency because it's comfortable. You bring complexity because it's powerful. They want to measure you. You refuse to stay still long enough to be measured. They will hand you a smaller version of yourself and call it balance. They'll wrap it in words like humility, teamwork, realism. They'll say it softly, like they're protecting you. Don't be too much. Don't go too far. You don't have to prove anything. It sounds kind. It sounds reasonable. It almost sounds wise. But listen closely. What they're really asking is this: shrink. Shrink your vision so it doesn't intimidate. Shrink your voice so it doesn't echo too loudly. Shrink your ambition so it doesn't expose their comfort. Stay within the invisible lines they've drawn on the floor. Fit into the shape that makes the room feel stable. Comfort zones are not neutral spaces. They are cages with padded walls. Soft enough that you don't feel the bruises right away. Quiet enough that you forget you're contained. Everyone inside agrees to the same ceiling. No one jumps too high. No one questions too hard. No one moves so fast that the rest feels slow. And then you arrive, with ideas that stretch past the edges, with standards that demand more, with energy that doesn't idle politely in the corner. You don't just occupy space, you expand it. And expansion makes comfortable people uneasy. Because when you refuse to shrink, you force contrast. Your hunger highlights their hesitation. Your discipline exposes their excuses. Your clarity unsettles their confusion. You don't have to criticize anyone. You don't have to compete loudly. Your existence at full capacity is enough to create tension. So they negotiate, tone it down, be realistic, know your place. That's their favorite phrase, as if your potential was assigned a seat number at birth, as if greatness requires permission, as if brilliance must file paperwork before it speaks. But comfort zones were built for maintenance, not momentum. If you compress yourself to fit their expectations, you don't become more likable. You become more forgettable. If you dilute your ideas to avoid discomfort, you don't create harmony. You create mediocrity. If you lower your standards to match the room, you don't build connection. You build resentment. Because somewhere deep inside, you'll know you betrayed your own capacity. Shrinking is seductive. It promises acceptance. It offers applause from people who were threatened by your full volume. It gives you temporary peace. No more tension. No more side eyes. No more whispers about being too much. But peace purchased with self-reduction is expensive. Every time you choose smaller, your edge dulls. Every time you mute your instinct, your confidence erodes. Every time you step back to make others comfortable, you train yourself to fear your own expansion. And fear is contagious. Once you start negotiating with your own brilliance, you begin to question it. You second-guess bold ideas. You hesitate before speaking. You measure your ambition against the room instead of against your potential. Slowly, subtly, you become easier to digest, easier to ignore. Comfort zones don't reward growth. They reward compliance. They celebrate predictability. They protect the average pace. But you were not built for average pacing. You were wired for acceleration, for intensity, for depth that makes shallow waters ripple. If your standards unsettle them, that's information. If your goals stretch beyond their imagination, that's confirmation. If your presence disrupts their balance, that's evidence you're operating beyond the boundaries they accepted. Never shrink to fit a space that refuses to grow. Let the room adjust. Let the system evolve. Let the ceiling crack under the weight of your refusal to compress. You are not responsible for maintaining someone else's comfort at the expense of your expansion. They may call you extreme. They may call you unrealistic. They may call you intimidating. But those labels are just defense mechanisms against the pressure your potential creates. And pressure reveals structure. You were not designed to fold into smaller shapes just to keep the walls intact. You were designed to test the walls,